So today is day 30, technically the last day of my Get Comfy challenge. But I decided that let's make tomorrow the last day, day 31. Because today I just simply want to talk about something else. Initially, I planned on using day 30 as like a recap or a reflection for myself and what I've learned, what I think has improved. But I thought of a better topic, I guess. So let's just move that for tomorrow. Because today I want to talk about photography and why gear doesn't really matter for the most part. Because I'm sure a lot of photographers have heard of this saying, gear doesn't matter. And for me personally, I believe that, but it's only partially correct. But let me talk about why it's partially correct later. Let me just say that yes, gear doesn't matter. What's important is that you understand your gear and understand the limitations of your gear and how you can either use that limitation to your advantage or counter that limitation with the photography techniques that you've learned. Now, I don't want to say, or I don't want to talk like I have mastered it, like I know everything, because I haven't. The least I have learned throughout the years in photography is that I have understood my gear. I understand the limitations, I understand what I need to do, but in terms of execution is where I am honestly still learning, because I still haven't been able to fully execute how I want to take advantage, or how I should take advantage of those limitations, or how I can use other techniques to actually turn that limitation into something that is at least usable and at most into an advantage. So let's just say, for example, I have this lens right here. Now, for most people who are not into photography, they would think that having a long zoom lens is a big advantage. But I'm sure most of you know, and especially Canon users, know and understand that this lens has a variable aperture, and even so, that aperture is the maximum aperture is very small on that lens. So it's not really great in low light, which means that if you want to take pictures of concerts or like street photography with the lens, it's not actually a very good lens to do so because of the small opening of the small aperture. Now, I'm sure none of you who are watching this, or some of you who are watching this, don't really fully understand what I'm talking about, and I guess I might talk about more photography things in the future. But an aperture is just the opening of the lens. So it's for this lens, the biggest opening is, for example, like this. But there are other lenses that have much bigger openings like this. So if you think about it logically, having this big of an opening means that more light can reach your sensor, and having small limits that light. So technically, this doesn't allow a lot of light to actually reach your sensor. So understanding that limitation, and understanding that limitation means that you try to at least for me, limits what I use this lens for. But there are lots of photographers out there who don't really care about those limitations, because not only do they understand the limits, they know how to utilize the lens in a way that actually, how should I say this? What's that term? That neglects that limitation. So let's say, for example, portrait photography. Photographers who shoot portraits will not really care about the small aperture. They might care about the quality of the lens, the sharpness that the lens produces, but in terms of the aperture, they won't really care, because a lot of portrait photographers prefer smaller apertures to get more of the face or more of the subject in focus. And again, this is related to physics. It's related to understanding more of the photography or technical side of photography. But just understand, if you have smaller apertures, although it limits how much light gets to your sensor, it also allows more of the stuff in your frame to be in focus. Whereas on the opposite end, when the aperture is bigger, yes, it allows for more light, but it has a shallower depth of field, which is like a thin paper that moves around. So it limits how much of your subject is in focus. So let's say, for example, you have like a lens with a big aperture and you set it to the biggest aperture that it can. The only thing, and you want to take a picture of me, the only things that might be in focus are either my eyes. If you miss focus, you might just get my mustache in focus or the tip of my nose in focus, and the rest will be blurry or just slightly blurry depending on where you focus. So that is like the physics of photography. Anyway, portrait photographers prefer having, well, I guess most portrait photographers who prefer having most of their subjects in focus, most of the features that their subjects have, prefer those smaller apertures. So to them, this isn't really a limitation, because they could also counter that limitation using lights. They could bring their own flash, their own, lights, or use the available amount of light to actually get more light into the sensor. And if all that fails, maybe even play with the settings a bit, play with the ISO, and you get more light. That's how you not only understand, but execute your understanding of the limitations of the gear. And that's just one example. Sometimes the camera itself isn't that good. Sometimes, yes, it can bring in more light, but when you play, there's this setting called ISO. When you play with the ISO and you brighten it up too much, certain cameras can handle the brighter image, but certain cameras, for example like this one, also has a limitation of what the maximum amount of ISO that they can handle. I mean, it can technically go, like, for example, it's from 100 to 200,000. Yes, certain cameras can go up to 200,000, but the way it processes that 200,000 ISO image is different in every camera, especially on older cameras. So let's say, for example, this camera right here, the 70D. For me personally, the most or the highest ISO that I can comfortably use is like 1600, because after that it creates a lot of noise. If you don't know what noise is, it's that grainy stuff that's in your pictures when it's too dark. That's noise, and it softens the image quite a lot. So that's another one of the limitations. Like I said, you have to understand the limitations, and you have to know how to execute certain techniques to actually counter those limitations. Again, for me personally, I understand most of the limitations of my cameras, but sometimes either I forget, or it just doesn't click into my head, or I just don't get it yet. I can't fully execute the techniques to actually counter those limitations. But that's not to say that every camera you use is objectively like this one is good, this one is bad. Not necessarily. It is subjective, because again, photography is kind of an art form. I mean, sometimes it's not, like for media photography, but most of the time it is. It's based on your own creative outlook, how you want to compose, how you want your pictures to come out. So for some people, just having a digicam, yes, the digital camera that everyone is hyped up about these days, people want that vibe, people want that old school digital era vibe. And some people don't get it. They just say, well, you already have your phone. Why do you need to take those pictures? Just because people like it. And again, gear doesn't really matter. You can take any picture with anything that you have, even with your phone. But sometimes it's just fun. And that's where I typically try to draw the line. Because for me personally, gear does matter when it comes to, first and foremost, the type of photography you're doing. Because if you're going to use a 70D to shoot sports or wildlife, yes, it's possible, but it doesn't necessarily have the speed that you would need to actually get the type of photos that, for example, like the frame is freeze. Yes, you can use it, but some limitations are just non-counterable. Is that a word? I don't know if that's a word. Anyway, some limitations just can't be counted. And that's the first line that I draw with the saying. Because sometimes people or photographers have specific needs, and only certain cameras can meet those needs. Some older cameras can't really meet those needs. Then there's the fun of it all. The fun of taking the pictures, the experience of taking the pictures, the colors that you would want. That's all something that you need to take account of at the end of the day as well. I mean, you could technically have fun with the camera that you currently have, but how should I say this? This is me mostly thinking of going back into the retro days, because for me personally, I know everyone wants the latest and greatest, and that's fine, that's okay. But like I said, some people like the vibe of older cameras, and I'm one of them. Sometimes I like the vibe of older digicams. Sometimes I like how they render the pictures. They are softer because, for example, smartphones, they process the pictures too much, so it's overly sharp for me. I want something that is a bit softer, and certain cameras in the past that come from the past have that. Modern cameras, yes, they're sharp, they are the best technology has to offer these days, but if you're looking for like a soft image, something that is dreamy, some people might prefer using gear from the past, and this is where the saying gear doesn't matter is I don't know why I keep forgetting certain terms and phrases. It's not neglected, not neglected. I guess what I'm trying to say is this is when the saying doesn't matter. So I guess that's where I draw the line. Yes, it's true that gear doesn't matter. You only need to understand the gear you have, understand its limitations, and know how to execute the proper techniques to counter those limitations. But certain people, certain photographers need certain gear as well, certain gear that suits their work, or certain gear that suits their creative outlet, their creative vision. And that's where gear does matter. Otherwise, you can definitely take a lot of good pictures with just, for example, your camera, your phone camera, or with an older DSLR like this one. It doesn't matter. Yeah, and that's day 30.